Eat, sleep, bet, repeat. That's how we get down on the opening line at EliteSportsBetting.com. I'll be your host, Benny Ricciardi, and as you can see, I'm all by myself here today, sitting in my room, just kind of hanging out with the fan on and the incredibly bright light in the background. Last week, we ran a little bit of a poll to kind of ask you guys, what are some of the things that you want us to kind of break down on the opening line now that we have no sports going on? So we're really not talking about a whole lot of opening lines or lines in general at the moment. But just kind of a quick overview of some of the things that you guys wanted to see us cover and, stuff that we could talk about that could help you guys become better sports bettors, better DFS players, better fantasy players in general. Two of the things that popped up highly on the list are kind of related in such a way that I wanted to kind of start the discussion here today. A lot of people were asking about DFS lineup building, and either this week or early next week, we'll do a video on that. But before we can really get into DFS lineup building, another one of the things that popped up highly and what I want to kind of talk about here today is projections and projection systems and how you can actually use these projections, whether it be for, finding props in sports betting or whether it be for building daily fantasy lineups or whether it be for making decisions in your season-long fantasy teams about who you want to start and who you want to sit. Because I think projections are one of the least understood things in all of fantasy sports at this point in time. And I think part of the problem is that people don't really understand how projections are made and what projections are actually doing, especially, with how you can use those to make your teams or make your decisions. So let's start right at the beginning here. What is a projection system? Basically what a projection system is, in its simplest form, is a way to try to predict the future, what will happen in the games coming up, based on the past, things that we have seen in the past. Now, there are different ways you can make adjustments to it, and we'll get into those here in a minute, but there's really two ways that a lot of people build their projection system. Technically, you could even say three ways because some ways take elements of both of these, but you can go from a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. So let's talk about the difference between the two so that you guys understand what it is, what the strengths are, and what the weaknesses. So a top-down approach would be something that a sports bettor would do because you're basically trying to find the total, the spread on the game, and then you're working backwards from there. So, basketball game, you do your numbers, you say, okay, my numbers say that this game should be, 112, 108. And then you go back and you individually fill in all the stats and everything based on how these guys have done over the years, how many points they average per game, how many shots they take, how many possessions we should have in this game. And you could kind of build a projected stat line for every player in that game that adds up to that 112 number or that 108 number. So that would be how you do a projection system from the top down. Now, from the bottom up, it's kind of the opposite. You start almost with the player stuff, the player information, and then you kind of crunch all that together to get the team information. So like I said, starting from the top down has some advantages. Starting from the bottom up has some advantages. And, basically you can get to the same place with projections by using either one of them or a combination of the two. But it's a good thing to know that the projections that you're using, the end product, the numbers that we're going to use to make decisions, whether it be in daily fantasy or in season-long fantasy, aren't just numbers that somebody's pulling out of the air. And despite what people think, they aren't. The Vegas totals can have something to do with the way some people create lines, but a lot of people don't even look at the Vegas totals when they're putting together their projections and figuring all that stuff out. I mean, serious sports bettors will make their own lines. They'll originate their own lines with, the numbers that they have. And then they will compare them to what the Vegas line is to figure out where their bets are. But the Vegas line doesn't always factor into all this stuff here. Now, again, you want things to make serious sense, though. So if you're looking at, say, a football projection, and your projection says this game's going to be 42 to 24, and you look at the Vegas projection and it's a 2-point game with a total of 41 between both of the teams, something's wrong there. Either Vegas is really, really wrong or you're really, really wrong. And I got to be honest, most of the time Vegas is not really, really wrong. Not that, your number can't be right and that Vegas, it doesn't mess things up every once in a while. But you got to remember that Vegas line is a line that's been looked at by tons of people out there, people bet on one side or the other, depending on where they thought it was. And that line landed somewhere in the middle of everybody's kind of feelings. For you to have an outlier that's that far out, it kind of doesn't make sense. So while I say the Vegas lines are not something that you have to factor into a projection system, you definitely want to make sure that things are kind of at least in the same ballpark. Otherwise, maybe there's some kind of variable that you're missing and, something that you need to get right. Otherwise, every other projection you're making off of whatever that original projection is probably going to be just as shit. We heard there's an old saying when you're doing projections that, shit in, shit out. If you put good stuff into your projections, you put in quality information, you're going to get spit out some quality information on the other end that's actionable and usable that you can use to either, like I said, make some sports bets or make your fantasy starters. If you put crap projections in on the front side, though, what comes out the back end is also going to be crap. Just because you have a projection system doesn't mean if you're putting crappy inputs in it that it's going to spit out something that's going to be actionable that you can use to make money, whether it be in the fantasy realm or in the sports betting realm. It's just not the way that projection systems work. So anyways, now that we know a little bit about how they're built, let's talk a little bit about how to use them and where we see them. So for the most part, especially nowadays, whether it's over here with us at Elite Fantasy or whether it's any of the other providers that are in the industry that are out there, just about everybody has their own projection system right now based off some proprietary algorithm that they put together. All of these things are big words, but here's basically the gist of what this all is, right? So people who put together an algorithm, what they're really doing is they're looking at all these different stats because we have tons of stats nowadays. We have access to more stats nowadays than we've ever had at any point in our lives. So let's take one sport and we'll kind of talk about it generally there. Let's say basketball, right? Now, basketball, you have things like field goal percentage. You have things like rebounding. You have things like assists. The main stats that everybody knows. Just like baseball, there's been kind of an explosion of secondary stats in all of these sports or advanced analytics, advanced metrics over the last couple of years. So you'll have things like an effective field goal percentage now or, points in the paint rebounding, which are more directly correlated to final scores and scoring, depending on how things are. You're going to have all these variables. So what you want to do is, basically people putting together these projection systems are testing these variables to say, all right, which of these variables is predictive of future scores that we could use past information to kind of predict how things are going to happen in the future. And again, all very technical here. I want to try to toe the line between explaining it enough so you guys understand what it is and not losing you guys because the explanation is a little bit too much, too much in the weeds and some guys aren't following along. But basically what you're doing is you're taking all these different things, you're seeing which one of these in the past have shown, the ability to predict what could happen in the future. And then you're using those as the inputs or the variables to the algorithm to get the numbers that we use or the numbers that you see in a projection system or an optimizer, like I said, whether it be on our fantasy site or any other site that you happen to use. Now that's a good way to go about it. There are some pitfalls you got to watch out for. Again, football is a good example here. If you do analysis on, which things have shown to be prevalent in games that certain football teams win, if you're trying to predict which teams are going to win football games, there are going to be things that you see that are predictive and are usable going forward. And there's going to be other things that you see that are a little more, regressive, where the relationship between having a good number in one spot and winning a football game may not be, exactly what you're looking for, pre-flop to be able to predict things. And the best example I can give of this that people understand the easiest is rushing yards for a running back, right? If you look at all the teams that won football games in the last 10 years or so, one of the numbers that's going to correlate very well to winning a football game is having a lot of rushing yards. But is there really a strong link between having a lot of rushing yards and winning football games? Because if so, then you would think that the thing that every team would want to do is make sure they put the best offensive line together and get the best running back and have the best rushing game if rushing game correlates so well to winning football games. But really what the numbers show you when you kind of look at that is that football games are more often won by teams that are, running the ball late in the game. So for example, if my team's up 24-2 or 24-3 in a football game here, I'm probably not going to be passing much in the second half. I'm going to be running the ball. I'm going to be keeping the clock running. I'm going to be trying to shorten the game and get to the end with the victory considering that I already have a pretty big lead, and it would be, if I screwed up a 24-3 lead in the second half, it would be something that, wouldn't happen very often and would be something that would be bad, right? But that doesn't mean that because I had a lot of rushing yards, I won the game. It means because I was winning the game, I was able to rack up a lot of rushing yards. So those are the things you have to kind of do when you're putting together an algorithm. You have to see what's actually predictive of future performance and what is just kind of noise, or what is something that, you're going to see in wins, but you're going to see it because the team changes the way that they play when they're winning a game or playing with the lead or something along those lines. So now, once you have this algorithm, whatever sport you're talking about here. So let's talk about football projections, because, or you know what, let's start with basketball, because basketball is actually the most straightforward. Now, people say that all the time, and people are like, oh, what do you mean it's the most straightforward? So here's the thing with basketball, right? Basketball is not an event-driven sport. If you play 20 minutes, you hear us talk a lot about like per minute averages or 36-minute averages and stuff like that for particular basketball players. That's because if you look, for the most part, a team's rotation is going to stay pretty much the same throughout the season, unless you have some injuries. Occasionally, there'll be a few mix-ups there. Sometimes there'll be a few changes because of matchups. But for the most part, a guy who plays 30 minutes, plays the first 8 minutes of the first quarter, for the last 6 minutes of the second, pretty much the same thing in the second half. His time isn't really going to change. He's going to basically be on that same schedule every game that basketball team plays, and so are all his teammates. So it's a lot easier to predict things that are going to go on in that time frame. The guys who are the big rebounders, sure, he might have 7 one game, he might have 14 another game, but when you take the whole season as a whole and you average it out, the per minute stats are going to kind of come in the middle of that. Now, there can be variance where it comes a few below or a few above, but for the most part, it's a pretty even line for basketball when you're talking about predictions. For a sport like football, you don't have that same kind of situation. And the reason for that is football is more of an event-driven sport, especially on the offensive side of the football. But technically, even if you're talking about team defenses as well, how many times do you have a team defense that goes out there and scores like 5 or 6 fantasy points? But if they have that variance of getting a touchdown that game, well, now they're a 12 or 13 fantasy point scoring defense, and they're one of the best defense you could have played in that week. Same thing goes for a running back. You see one running back who has 17 carries for 75 yards, no catches, no touchdowns. It's kind of a blah fantasy game, 6, 7 points, depending on, what kind of scoring system your league has. When he does get that touchdown, though, you can see a guy who maybe you only had projected for 50 or 60 yards, but let's say that guy got 2 carries at the 1 yard line. Well, now he's got 17 fantasy points, even though in the projection system, you probably had him projected for half a touchdown, which would be worth 3 fantasy points because a touchdown is worth 6. And you had him for 50 yards, which would be worth another 5. So you had a guy projected for 8 and he wound up scoring 17. That does happen. And people need to understand that kind of variance is something that's not really, I don't want to say it's not built into projection systems, but the way that most people use projection systems, they don't take into account the fact that those kind of things can happen. And this is what I wanted to explain today. If you get one thing out of this video today, this is what I want you guys to understand. So when you're putting together a projection system, right, when you guys go and look at, say, our optimizer over at Elite Fantasy, you're going to see all the players and you're going to see some kind of projection number. Usually there's a raw number projection, and then next to that raw number projection or somewhere along that line is the price that player cost. And then you'll see somewhere at the end of that line is the projection divided by the price to give you a points per dollar number or a value number, whatever you call it. Different companies, different optimizers all call it the same thing, but it's all basically the same concept. That's a number that a lot of people use. A lot of people look at the raw score, they divide it by the price, they see what that point per dollar number is, and that's a number that they use to build a team. Now, I don't think that that's a horrible way to go about doing things, especially if you're playing cash games and that's the way you want to build a cash game team. I'm perfectly on board with that. It makes perfect sense to me. I think you're smart for going that route. You're at least trying to use some kind of math and analytics to make decisions. You're not just shooting from the hip and saying, hey, I really want this guy to win or I really want that guy to win. I really want this team to win. I think this team's going to do well, or this guy's going to crush this team. You're actually backing up your thoughts with at least a little bit of math. So I commend you guys on that. The problem is there is a major flaw in projection systems that I don't think people really understand when they're building teams. And I want to explain to you guys what that flaw is, not so that you stop using projection systems, because I still think projection systems are good, but this way you can use the projection system better. So here's the deal. When we put those numbers in there, the raw numbers, so let's pick a player. Let's say Lamar Jackson, okay? So when we put a Lamar Jackson number into our algorithm or our projection system, the number for his game might be 27. What is that 27 actually, though? Does that mean that Lamar Jackson is going to go out and score 27 points every time he plays this game? No, not at all. What that number actually is, any good projection system is probably running some kind of simulation where they put all the stats that they have into like a supercomputer, basically, and it'll play a certain game 1,000 times. So for those of you who are video games guys, think about like going and simulating a game on Madden literally 1,000 times or 10,000 times, depending on, what the program that you're using is. During those 10,000 times, Lamar Jackson is not going to score 27 fantasy points 10,000 games straight. The number that he scores is going to be around 27. That 27 is probably an average of the 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 simulations that a projection system is running. But that doesn't mean that every single time Lamar Jackson goes out and plays that game in this matchup, he is guaranteed to get a floor of 27 or a ceiling of 27, or even is going to score 27 points most of the time. Think of it as a graph here, right? So we have Lamar Jackson fantasy points. You run 10,000 simulations. There may be one of those simulations where he scores 60 fantasy points. There may also be one of those simulations where he scores 5 fantasy points. There's also, if you're running 10,000 simulations, there's also 9,998 simulations that fall between that high point of 60-something and that low point of 5. The 27 number is kind of the average of all these. But as you can see, just by looking at the two outliers that we mentioned here, 5 and 65, an average of 27, you could get there a lot of different ways. You could have 50 games out of that 1,000 where he scores over 40 fantasy points. You could have 50 games where he scores under 10 fantasy points. You could have 2,000 or 3,000 games where he scores between 10 and 18 fantasy points. You could have 2,000 or 3,000 games where he scores between 30 and 60-something fantasy points. And then you probably also have some kind of distribution in the middle where you're playing 40 or 50% of those games where he does score like 25 or 22 to like 30 fantasy points. So within one maybe standard deviation of, those two numbers that you have there. And that's the way that these curves kind of work. If you actually plotted out the 10,000 different, simulation scores that you get for Lamar Jackson, you're not going to see them all in the exact same spot. You're going to see some well above that line. You're going to see some well below that line. And then you're going to see a huge cluster of them that are right about whatever that number is. So again, if that number is 27, again, I haven't done the number right here for Lamar Jackson, but maybe the standard deviation is a couple points either way. So if it's 3 points, 24 to 30 is where you're going to see a huge bulk of his scores. But there's also going to be 10 or 15% of the scores where he scores 35 and 10 or 15% where he scores 18 or 17, where you're 10, 15 points below it there. And that's the thing that people need to understand is just because you see, well, Lamar Jackson has a number of 27 and Patrick Mahomes only has a number of 25, it must be better to play Lamar Jackson. I'm going to go ahead and play Lamar Jackson in every lineup I make here today because he projects better than Patrick Mahomes. Yes, it does make sense that Lamar Jackson should outperform Patrick Mahomes most of the time, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen all the time. If Lamar Jackson has one of those middle-of-the-road 50% games around 27, and Patrick Mahomes has one of his 70 or 80 percentile games where he's a little bit above that, well, he only needs 3 points to get above the Lamar Jackson 50% game. So it's really not that hard to envision a guy like Patrick Mahomes outscoring a guy like Lamar Jackson, even though the Patrick Mahomes projection was 24 and Lamar Jackson projection is 27. There's still a large number of outcomes between those two guys where Mahomes is going to outscore Lamar Jackson. Now, is Lamar Jackson going to outscore Mahomes more often in a projection? Probably, but if you're talking about a projection that's really like 1 or 2 points here or there on some of these guys, it's not like Lamar Jackson is 80% more likely to outscore Patrick Mahomes. And in all honesty, it's probably closer to like 50 or 60%, which still means that Patrick Mahomes is going to outscore him 40 to 50% of the time or so. That's still a big number. I mean, 4 out of 10, you're still going to wind up winning things. So you got to understand that these projections that are coming out, the number that's on the projections is basically an average of about 10,000 different simulations, or 5,000 or 1,000. Everybody runs their simulations different. But when you run these simulations, you're coming up with an average number. That average number is a good example. I got 3 kids right now at home with this whole COVID-19 thing going on, doing homeschooling. And my one son is doing things like averages. And I said to him, the numbers 9, 10, and 11 average out to 10. The numbers 0, 10, and 20 also average out to 10. But it's very different between having 9, 10, and 11 as your potential outcomes, and then having 0, 10, and 20 as your potential outcomes. Or to put this into something that you guys can understand a little better, a quarterback who has a total of 21, or a quarterback who has a projection of 21, it might be a guy like Carson Wentz who's very solid every week and puts up 15 to 25 fantasy points on a weekly basis. Or you could have a guy like, Ryan Fitzpatrick is probably a good example of this. There are weeks where Fitzmagic looks great and he throws 3 touchdowns and runs in another one and puts up 35 fantasy points. There are other weeks where Fitzmagic throws 5 interceptions and puts up 0. Now, when you're looking at a projection, if I'm playing a cash game, I want the guy whose projection more often than not falls within that major range. Maybe his range is a little bit bigger than the other guy. The other guy might have a smaller middle range and more on the outliers. Whereas a guy like Carson Wentz might have a big middle range, but you're not really going to get a lot of upside out of him, but you're also not really going to get a lot of downside out of him. And that's why Carson Wentz in this projection system, using these projections, is more of one of those guys that you would use in the cash game, because he is likely to get you that 18 to 24 on a projection of 21. Probably more often than a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick would if he had that same projection of 21. Because Ryan Fitzpatrick's projection of 21 factors in a couple really bad games where he has 10 points or less, and also a couple obnoxiously ridiculous off-the-chart Fitzmagic games where he throws 4 touchdowns or has 350 yards and just does one of those crazy things there and puts up 35 fantasy points. Now, if you're playing in a GPP, and again, I don't want to get too deep into the whole lineup building thing because we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but I want to make sure I mention enough that you guys understand the concept I'm trying to get at here. When you look at a GPP, Fitzmagic and that upside is something that you would probably be more interested in than Carson Wentz. Because while Fitzmagic may not have the consistency, and there may be more times where a guy like that kills your lineup, there's also more times than a guy like Carson Wentz who never really flashes huge upside to win you a GPP or something like that. If you catch the right Fitzmagic game, if you caught, the right Fitzmagic game when he had that 4 or 5 touchdown game with the Jets, or some of those 4 or 5 touchdown games with Tampa Bay, or even some of the games that people were off of him last year where he ran in a touchdown and threw 2 other ones for Miami, you could wind up winning a lot of money that week in daily fantasy and GPPs and things like that, because you have a guy that nobody else played that did still have that same kind of upside that some of these other studs had. If you get a solid game out of Mahomes, they win by 2 touchdowns, the running game is big. Mahomes only puts up 27. And, same thing with Lamar Jackson. They have a, big rushing game at the beginning, and every one of the running backs in the stable winds up getting a touchdown. So he only winds up with 25 fantasy points. It's not crazy to look at a guy like Fitzpatrick and say, hey, they were an underdog trying to stay in the game, and he threw 2 second-half touchdowns and wound up running another one in the 1-yard line for a game-winning touchdown after a pass interference call or something like that. It's not crazy to think that you could get Fitzmagic to beat those other 2 guys and give yourself a quarterback at 1 or 2% that nobody else had. And really, when you look at the projections, again, it would be way too much information to take the scatter chart for every other player and show you where each one of those 10,000 games in the simulation came from. But realize that not all projections are created equal. So when you see that one guy projects for 21 fantasy points and another guy projects for 27, it doesn't mean that the guy with 21 will never outscore the guy with 27. It means it's less likely, absolutely, because his average is probably closer there. But there are still scenarios in that 10,000 plot thing that if you put one scenario over the other, the player with the lower projection still outscores the player with the higher projection, depending on which dot of his is the one that happens to come out and which dot of the other guy's is. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these projections, especially nowadays in the fantasy community. Everybody has access to the same information. 3 or 4 years ago, you could have won a ton. Well, we did. A lot of us won a lot of money because some of us were able to put these numbers together and were playing with them, and other people were just shooting blind and picking names and trying to figure out some combination of guys that they could put together without actually having any data to back it up. People are scared of data, but data it's your friend. I mean, it's basically painting the picture for you, and you should be using it if you're somebody who's betting seriously or playing some kind of fantasy sports seriously. But again here, not only do I want you to use the data, I kind of want you to understand where it comes from and what these numbers you're using are actually telling you. Again, seeing a little bit of a higher score for a Patrick Mahomes than a Lamar Jackson or vice versa doesn't mean that the other guy can't outscore his peer. As a matter of fact, these two guys could put up 50 fantasy points on any given day and outscore everybody else on the quarterback chart. We've all seen it happen before. There were days where they even went off together and they both put up 35, 40. There were other days, though, where they both were not bad, but just not great, and both put up 20. And on the days with 20 and on the days where they put up 40, the ownership on these guys is the same. They're 15, 20% owned in tournaments and things like that because they are the highest scoring guys, and they are consistently the highest scoring guys. But like I said, there were also weeks this year where random quarterbacks who didn't project higher than these guys wound up outscoring them. And that's because even though it wasn't the average for that guy or what you would expect if you played that game 10,000 times, we're not playing these games 10,000 times. We're playing them once out there on a Sunday. And if you happen to have that good game that's the outlier dot on that chart on the Sunday, that's how many fantasy points you get, whether you were projected for 22 or whether you were projected for 35. So remember, when you're looking at this, I'm not saying projection systems are bad. Obviously, they're very good. But you need to be able to understand what the projection system you are looking at or you are using is telling you. If you see that a guy has a projection of 25, what that actually probably means is, if you played this game 10,000 times, 25 would be the average number that you would take if you added up all his scores from those 10,000 games. If you're trying to figure out what a guy's going to do on a given day, though, you want to find out what the big part of the curve is or where most of those games are going to fall. And that tends to be either a few points below that projected number or a few points above that projected number. So if a guy projects for 25, most likely you're going to get somewhere between like 21 and 29 out of them. Probably 80, 90% of the time. But there is also that 10% of the time where he could go off and put up 40, or he could get hurt on the first play of the game and put up 0. When you're playing in tournaments, that's really what you're hoping to capture. You're hoping to capture that 40-point upside game, that 10%, that top 5 or 10% outlier that makes you the guy who has the highest scoring quarterback on the week and takes down a GPP. Now, again, that's more likely to be the guys like the Lamar Jacksons and the Patrick Mahomes that have the higher averages anyway, but it's not always those guys. And if those guys are the ones that are getting overbet, trying to find some of the guys that are 5% owned or 3% owned that can put up those same numbers or have that same kind of day here today, even though their projections are a little lower, is a way that you can find a guy that can help you win a GPP. So don't be a slave to the number. The number is the average, but again, there's a wide range that goes into that, and there's a wide combination of how this guy performs versus that guy that could make one guy a higher scoring player than the other. If you take that one thing away from this talk about projections here today, then I will have done my job, and you will be ready to talk about how we can use this information to build lineups, which is what we'll do the next time we have one of these one-on-one discussions. So for Benny Ricciardi, this has been another episode of The Opening Line at EliteFantasySports.com.